This is a bonus episode of History as It Happens. It's Wednesday, September 24th. Americans are again arguing over the right to argue, to speak openly and freely, to say mean things about one another. Free expression, protected by the First Amendment, is a legal right. The government may not persecute you for words. It is also a cultural value, and it is under attack on college campuses and on late-night television.
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it.
Well, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that was Jimmy Kimmel talking about the murder of Charlie Kirk, how Kirk's admirers were politicizing the tragedy in his view. Well, then the FCC chairman Brendan Carr went on a MAGA influencers podcast and threatened ABC, Kimmel's employer.
I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
And you know what happened next. Kimmel's show was yanked off the air, causing an uproar. The comedian and his program, which I've never watched, returned to the airwaves last night. So what is going on here? After complaining for years that liberals and leftists and snowflakes invented cancel culture to go after conservatives, that they're intolerant and censorious, the Trump administration is now going after speech it doesn't like, even though Trump himself said this upon returning to office.
I will also sign an executive order to immediately stop all government censorship and bring back free speech to America.
More recently, his Attorney General Pam Bondi said this on Katie Miller's podcast after Kirk's death.
There's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie, in our society. We will absolutely target you, go after you, if you are targeting anyone.
And then the president, who did say he wanted to defend free speech, said this in response to a question from ABC's Jonathan Karl in the Oval Office.
Settle this free speech question, because you've said that you restored free speech in America.
Yeah.
Is that free speech including for people who are harshly critical of you, for your political opponents, for people who say things you don't like, who treat you unfairly?
Well, I'm winning. I'm winning the cases, and the reason I'm winning is because you're guilty, John. You're guilty. ABC is a terrible network, a very unfair network, and you should be ashamed of yourself. NBC is equally bad. I don't know who's worse. I think they're equally bad. And, for you to stand there and act so innocent and ask me a question like that. But look, you paid a big price because you were dishonest, John. The reason I won that lawsuit was because you were dishonest. You were proven to be dishonest. And so you can't sit back and just say, oh, well, what do you think? Like you're some wonderful person. You're not a wonderful person. Frankly, you're a terrible reporter. You know it, and so do I.
Greg Lukianoff is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE, as the group is commonly referred to. He wrote a New York Times op-ed saying critics of the idea of hate speech, including my organization, have long warned that the concept is so vague and broad it provides a handy weapon to censor almost any opinion. Unfortunately, he says, we've been vindicated on this point. Consider, too, the fight against so-called misinformation and disinformation. The Biden administration, he reminds us, created and then quickly shuttered, following criticism, an advisory board at the Department of Homeland Security on the threat of disinformation. The Biden administration also pressured social media platforms to censor Americans who posted what the administration considered obvious falsehoods, including the suggestion, now considered plausible by a large assortment of mainstream institutions and experts, that the coronavirus originated from a lab in Wuhan, China. Today, he says, the right is making the same mistakes. So, to paraphrase Chomsky, you're either for free speech or you're not. Now, there have always been consequences for speech. People do need to be free to destroy their own reputations. For instance, I don't think many of you would continue to listen to this podcast if I dedicated every episode to praising Adolf Hitler. But where is the boundary between, say, criticizing bad ideas and cancel culture, canceling someone, uninviting someone to speak at your institution because other people don't want to hear what they have to say? I just saw another example of this. A bookstore in New Jersey canceled an event with an author because people complained about her past statements criticizing Israel. Free speech as a cultural value. Let's look at FIRE's new college survey. 166 of the 257 schools surveyed got an F for their speech climate. A record 1 in 3 students now hold some level of acceptance, even if only rarely, for resorting to violence to stop a campus speech. 1 out of 3. I'll share a link to this depressing survey in my weekly newsletter on Substack and in the show notes to this episode. Bob Corn-Revere has been a First Amendment litigator for more than 4 decades. He is the author of The Mind of the Censor and the Eye of the Beholder, The First Amendment and the Censor's Dilemma, published in 2021. He is now FIRE's chief counsel, the aforementioned Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Bob Corn-Revere, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Martin. It's great to be here.
So Jimmy Kimmel's suspension, or whatever it was, is over. He's returning to the airwaves, but not all is right in the Republic. How concerned are you about the climate in the country in terms of tolerance of disagreement and free speech?
Well, I am concerned about the state of the country, and it has partly to do with the law of free speech and partly to do with the culture of free expression. At FIRE, we defend more than just the law of free speech. That's the minimum floor. That's the constitutional requirement. Limits what government can do in terms of silencing individuals or media organizations. It is the basic law of free speech, and it remains strong. But there's also a broader climate and culture of free expression that is important to defend. It's Learned Hand, a famous jurist, gave a famous speech in 1943 called The Spirit of Liberty. And he says that the spirit of liberty lives in the minds and hearts of men and women. And if it dies there, no law, no constitution can save it. And no law, no constitution can do much to help it. And it's that culture of free expression and a spirit of liberty that is important to remember, and it's important to bolster in our society right now.
Yeah, this is, of course, nothing new. The Sedition Act under John Adams in the 1790s, while the ink on the Constitution was still drying, of course. But, just like political violence, regardless of who's doing it or who's being targeted, it affects all of us, regardless of politics. Censorship or crackdowns on free expression affects all of us, regardless of politics. The head of your group, FIRE, actually has an op-ed in the New York Times saying that the censorship you support today will be used against you at some point in the future.
Yeah, we see this all the time, and that's particularly poignant when you look at the ways in which current chairman of the FCC, Brendan Carr, has been all over the place when it comes to free expression. As a commissioner of the FCC, he was repeatedly talking about how the federal government does not have the authority to censor. It shouldn't be the nation's speech police. And yet his position has changed markedly since he's become Donald Trump's chair of the FCC and has been using the authority of the FCC, or more importantly, threatening to use the authority of the FCC to come down on broadcasters. So you see that kind of shift depending on who's in power all the time. And it really doesn't matter which administration is in power, whether it's Republican or Democratic. Either one is violating the Constitution if they're threatening to use their power to silence somebody's speech.
His op-ed reminded me of a conversation I had, an argument with somebody at a party about, 6-7 years ago. I was trying to tell this person, and this was during the high tide of the mantra on the left, that words are violence. I was trying to tell this person, you may say that now to silence or, revoke invitations to people you disagree with on the right, who are invited to campuses, whatever. I told this person, you wait, this will be turned against the people who need it most, marginalized people, regardless of politics, at the first opportunity. Alas, we saw what happened to the college protesters who were protesting Israel's war in Gaza. They were suppressed. And people who did not like what they were saying said that their words were violent or making them feel uncomfortable or unsafe on campus.
Well, that's right. And that metaphor of trying to say that words are violence is both false and truly destructive. And if there's any greater demonstration of the difference between words and violence, the assassination of Charlie Kirk very graphically demonstrates that they are not the same thing, particularly if you equate them and think that you can use violence to stop words, then you really have subverted not just the concept of free expression, but of the very meaning of the words of the English language. They are radically different, and they should not be confused.
Let's fire through some specific issues now. Did the FCC chairman who you mentioned, Brendan Carr, did he violate the First Amendment when he threatened ABC over Kimmel's remarks?
Yes. And if you'd like me to elaborate.
Sure.
This is a concept that in general First Amendment law was made quite clear by the Supreme Court just this last term. In a case called NRA versus Vullo, the court unanimously reaffirmed the principle that government actors can't threaten adverse regulatory action or promise favorable regulatory action in order to change the speech that's out there, either to suppress speech they don't like or to get people otherwise to change their editorial policies. And that's been the law since 1963 at the Supreme Court, and it applies generally across all media platforms and generally for speech protected by the First Amendment. Beyond that, the FCC is an agency of limited powers. Not that Brendan Carr would agree with that in his recent pronouncements, but the Communications Act of 1934 contains express limitations on what the FCC can do. Section 326 of the Act expressly denies the power of censorship to the commission or even to set conditions that would interfere with the right of free speech. It does allow regulation in the public interest, but that regulation is very limited and does not empower the FCC to do things that violate the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has made quite clear again and again that the public interest standard of the Communications Act is limited and must be interpreted with the First Amendment in mind.
You started answering my next question, which is, the FCC can take action against a broadcaster under certain circumstances for certain violations, right? Like a hoax that causes a public panic, right? What are some of these instances, briefly?
Well, that's right. But even those examples are highly limited. The FCC is mainly a technical body designed to prevent broadcasters from interfering with each other in their use of the electromagnetic spectrum. There is some authority over broadcast content, but it has always been interpreted to be very limited. The examples you talk about, broadcast hoaxes, there are maybe a handful.
To listen to this entire episode, go to historyasithappens.supercast.com to subscribe.